Let's just jump right in and play detective today. Welcome to our latest explainer, where we're going to investigate the historical origins of Islamic monotheism. You know, we tend to think of history as this simple, straight line, but when you actually start digging into the archaeological and linguistic evidence, the past reveals a much more complex and, honestly, way more fascinating story. So today we're going to dust off some ancient stones and look at an absolute geopolitical Cold War to understand exactly how two competing names, Allah and Ar-Rahman, ended up forging a single absolute high god in the Arabian Peninsula.
This right here is our inciting mystery. Did Islam introduce a completely new god to the world, or did it radically redefine an existing one? If the new faith proclaimed an absolute monotheism centered entirely on Allah, we really have to look at the physical evidence to see if that specific name was already hiding out there in the Arabian sands. Understanding this completely changes how we view the evolution of world religions. Because think about it, if the name already existed long before the 7th century, then this movement wasn't introducing a brand new deity in a historical vacuum. Instead, it did something arguably way more powerful. It took something deeply familiar and completely redefined it.
So let's start by dusting for prints and looking at the linguistic evidence. Before we even get into geography or empires, we need to look at the word itself and its shared Semitic DNA.
What's truly captivating here is that Allah wasn't originally born as a proper, exclusive name. Most linguists and historians agree it's actually a contraction of the Arabic al-ilah, which quite literally translates to the God. So it began as a title, and this evolution wasn't happening in isolation at all. Pre-Islamic Arabia was this bustling, diverse linguistic ecosystem. In the centuries leading up to the 7th century, Arabic-speaking Christians and Jewish tribes were totally embedded in this environment, and they were already using these terms. It directly parallels the Syriac word Allah and the Hebrew Elohim. These early monotheists were moving within a deeply shared linguistic world where Allah was essentially the standard recognized translation for the creator God of the Bible. They shared a vocabulary.
Now, moving from language to hard facts, we've got to follow the paper trail left behind on stones in the north.
We are looking for epigraphy, basically inscriptions carved by regular everyday people. Between the 1st century BCE and the 4th century CE, you had Safatidic and Hismaic nomadic groups wandering the desolate, breathtaking landscapes of the North Arabian deserts. And as they traveled, they carved oaths like "By Allah" or "May Allah remember" right into the rocks. Meanwhile, over in the majestic rock-cut city of Petra, the wealthy Nabateans were using the generic term Ilah and clearly trending toward a singular, elevated deity concept. What this proves is that nomadic tribes and powerful traders alike were already embedding the word Allah into their personal, daily religious language long before the 7th century. This wasn't just elite theology debated by scholars. It was the fundamental vocabulary of the common people.
And if you want a historical smoking gun in our investigation, well, this is it. Imagine unearthing a stone in the Syrian desert, carved by people whose empires have long since vanished, only to find the exact phrase that over 1 billion people use today. This is the Zebd inscription. It's dated precisely to 512 CE. It is a trilingual inscription carved in Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, and it begins with the powerful phrase, "In the name of God." Specifically in Arabic, BSM, al-Alih. This is a monumental find. It proves that this exact liturgical formula, the one that would later become the foundational opening of almost every single chapter in the Quran, was already active and being used by Arab Christians well over a century before the dawn of Islam.
But just as we think we have this case completely closed and that Allah was simply the universally accepted God of Arabia, we have to talk about the southern rival, Ar-Rahman. We travel down to Yemen in South Arabia and we uncover a massive plot twist. So the dominance of Allah was definitely not a universal truth across the entire peninsula. Think about the stark geographical contrast we have here. In the rugged, nomadic north, Allah was absolutely the recognized and dominant high god. But down in the south, in the lush, highly developed kingdoms of ancient Yemen, a place the Romans actually called Happy Arabia, the name Allah is largely missing from their monumental inscriptions. Instead, the south had cultivated its own highly developed, heavily worshipped high god known as Rahmanan, which translates to Al-Rahman, or the Merciful. The Arabian Peninsula was literally split down the middle in this geopolitical battle of the names between the northern Allah and the southern Al-Rahman.
To truly understand why this north-south split mattered so much, we have to zoom out and look at the macro geopolitics of late antiquity. Arabia was essentially a fractured buffer zone squeezed between two massive warring empires in a global Cold War. To the north and west, you had the mighty Christian Byzantines. To the east, the formidable Zoroastrian Sassanid Persians. And both of these superpowers drew immense political and military strength from having one exclusive state god. Having a single high god meant centralized power, the divine right of kings, and unified military morale. Arabia, on the other hand, was deeply fragmented by tribal allegiances and competing regional deities, which left them incredibly vulnerable to being swallowed up by these imperial giants.
To survive on the world stage and resist that imperial domination, the Arabs desperately needed to unify, which brings us to the Great Unification, merging the names.
They needed a religious identity as vast and singular as their powerful neighbors. And this is the brilliant resolution to our investigation. When you look at the Quran, you see it frequently uses the name Ar-Rahman right alongside Allah. This wasn't just a redundant use of adjectives. It was a deliberate, highly sophisticated move to synthesize the northern title with the southern title. It acknowledged the northern high god, Allah, totally embraced the southern high god, Ar-Rahman, and seamlessly synthesized them into a single, unified deity. It wasn't some copy-paste theological job. It was a masterful stroke of religious diplomacy. It sent a very clear message. To the north it said, "We hear you." And to the south it said, "We are with you." By merging these two regional heavyweights into one, the new movement politically and theologically unified a fractured peninsula under a single banner.
Now that the names were unified on a macro level, we are looking at a new kind of God. But they had to tackle a major practical problem right in their own backyard of Mecca. The issue wasn't that the locals didn't know who Allah was. It was how they were actually treating him.
This brings us to a really fascinating concept used by historians of religion called deus achiosis. It literally translates to an idol god or an absentee landlord. In pre-Islamic Mecca, Allah was widely recognized as the creator and the high god. Even the powerful local Quraysh tribe branded themselves as the people of Allah. But for the average person living their life, Allah was seen as too vast, too cosmic, and honestly just too distant to bother with for daily practical needs. Think of it like the CEO of a massive global corporation. You know they exist, you know they built the company, but if your office printer breaks, you don't email the CEO, you call the local IT guy. In Mecca, instead of praying directly to the absentee landlord, the locals prayed to accessible intermediaries, basically lesser deities, for things like rain, good crops, and a safe caravan journey.
And this right here is exactly what the true monotheistic revolution was all about. The massive theological paradigm shift wasn't going from no God to Allah. The radical change was taking a shared, distant high God and transforming him into an absolute, directly accessible deity. The Quran's mission was essentially a hostile takeover of the local religious hierarchy. It completely divorced the law from that pantheon of tribal intermediaries. It basically fired all the local middlemen. By reclaiming the existing People of Allah brand and stripping away everything else, the new faith demanded exclusive worship. It insisted that the ultimate CEO of the universe was actually directly available to every single person, without any need for spiritual brokers whatsoever.
Which leaves us with a massive, absolutely fascinating anomaly to investigate as our case continues. If the concept of a high god was already completely established, why on earth did the Meccans believe he had daughters? Were the prominent goddesses Alat, Al-Uzza, and Manat an actual family tree of the divine? Or were they just a really clever political metaphor used by the elite tribes to maintain power and control over the local trade routes? We are going to dive deep into the battle for the feminine divine in Arabia in our next explainer. Until then, keep questioning the narrative, and I'll catch you next time.